Hi, Sharon Danley here, and this video is about sexual abuse of many women by healthcare professionals. Because of the Jian Ghomeshi upset in recent months, there's been a lot of talk about the sexual abuse of women. And of course, there's sexual abuse of men. But I'm focusing on patients of doctors and other healthcare professionals, and mostly women in this. The Ontario government has announced it's never okay with respect to sexual abuse. The Ontario Health Minister has ordered a task force on the sexual abuse of patients by doctors and other healthcare professionals under the regulated Act of 91 with respect to all of the self-governing colleges. In researching, I came across the deputation that I made in 2000 to another task force on the same subject. That is not recorded anywhere, so I'm going to record it today for you to give you the gist of what was said back then. This was presented to the task force Mary Lou McPhedran as chair, Dr. Harvey Armstrong, Dr. Roz Roach, Pat Marshall, and Rhonda Besner. To the committee. As I wrote this, I became increasingly aware of how deeply I've buried my mammoth rage at the systems and the people who have hurt me and others so intensely, all in the name of power, control, and greed. Having my pediatrician sexually assault me with my baby son in my arms, who is in cardiac crisis, was one defiling act. But when I finally mustered up the courage to confront this man and try to prevent him from committing his acts of sexual abuse on other unsuspecting women, I cannot tell you how profoundly betrayed I was by the system that purported to help. The CPSO promised me protection. They promised me, and they lied. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I was emotionally and publicly gang raped by the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario because I spoke up and pointed the finger at a sexual abuser, and the law and the government stood by and let it happen, using whatever excuses they could find to support their negligence. This doctor was finally found guilty of sexual impropriety, but not of medical negligence, when there was documented proof that he was indeed guilty on that count too. He did the crime, but I paid the time with my lost savings, lost work, my retirement safety, my relationship with my children, my marriage, my lifestyle, my history, my intelligence, my character, and my soul. After 4 years, he was finally found guilty in 1994 for having assaulted me and one other of the 7 women who came forward because I'd had the courage to publicly let my name stand. And this person, who was only other one, was allowed to testify. This doctor retired in financial safety, and never having served his slap on the wrist suspension of 3 months, while I was homeless for 18 months. I lost everything. The very first week, when submissions were made for penalty, and while I was suffering acute fibromyalgia and then intense post-traumatic stress, I was assaulted by my chiropractor and another healthcare professional in the same week. The latter, which I dealt with to satisfaction outside the so-called protection of the system. However, when I foolishly went through the chiropractic tribunal system, and to my vehement stance that I would not allow myself to be assaulted a second time, my lawyer allowed the testimony of a psychiatrist who had never met me or ever talked to me, negatively tagged me with a convenient psychiatric label based on a paper I had presented to the Therapist Naturopathy Symposium as a survivor of sexual abuse by a doctor. When I finally found myself to be a recipient of the shelter system, I was threatened with eviction there because I hadn't found a place to live within 6 weeks. The relationship with my children had massively deteriorated. What friends I had left abandoned me because I was too difficult a reminder of what could happen to a person who spoke up. When I finally got into a home, I contacted the CPSO to find out the status of the offending doctor. He had gone into the Ontario Court of Appeals and hid there for 18 months while he continued working. If I hadn't contacted the college, I believe he would still be working to this day. I understand the Court of Appeals only gives a year to pursue an action. How is it the CPSO didn't keep abreast of this man's status on an ongoing basis? When I asked the college what they would do, I was told by the complainant's person, later discovered to be a disbarred lawyer, that he would get back to me. 2 days later, I was contacted and told that the doctor had abandoned his appeal and retired. When I asked the question, what about the suspension, I was told that if this 64-year-old ever wanted to reactivate his license, then he would have to serve a suspension at that time. So, nothing ever happened. He continued to work, and with no warning to the public. And when I, the victim, not the college, investigated his status, he just up and retired. He obviously had a good length of time to get his financial house in order, and to my knowledge, he has never paid back the legal expenses incurred by the taxpayers for his defense. Once again, the message is, victims beware. Perpetrators, not at worry. When I finally applied for therapy through the Patient Relations Committee at the CPSO, I was told that I had to go through traditional therapy, even though I had zealously pointed out that I could no longer trust traditional therapists, as I was consistently betrayed by them. I even did a cost analysis and explained it in every way and showed how I needed alternative forms of therapy, and I detailed their proof of benefits, but the CPSO wouldn't listen. They said, "We are not legislated to pay direct." How convenient is that? Further, they stated they would pay the therapist, not me. God forbid I should handle my own therapy money, and God further forbid that I should spend it in a way that suits me as the victim. Further still, I had to sign a confidentiality about the money. Why? When I refused, I was told that I couldn't have it. When I spoke to them of the spirit of the RHPA rather than the letter of it, I was patronized and further ignored. How is it that the CPSO can so blatantly father victims' money? Oh, and just a little aside, isn't it the taxpayers who would be paying for any victim's therapy through OHIP? The Criminal Injuries Compensation Board doesn't get that involved. They pay the victim, and the victim decides what they need, and they get it. However, that suits them. I then turned to the Minister of Health to intervene, to no avail. They aren't legislated to intervene, and the CPSO isn't legislated to do the right thing. The outright vile arrogance of both these systems is unconscionable. When I pursued the minister's office, I was told that I needed to be more creative about my approach. I think in a desperate attempt to help me get them off their backs. So creative I got, and the money I received. I am now in a situation, and against all odds, of being able to rebuild my life, but I don't trust the medical systems to this day. I haven't had a pap smear nor a mammogram in years now because of my disdain and inability to trust. It's too high and too paramount, and my disgust and fear of authority in all forms of government makes it an impossible task for me to do my taxes and create business and retirement plans, and now I'm having to seek therapy for this. What concerns me with the length of time that is strategically being taken to do anything concrete is that all of the hierarchical offenders will be retiring, and it will be a new crop of people who will take over. Once again, the offenders get off scot-free and leave a horrible mess to be cleaned up and readdressed by others who aren't the responsible ones. Now, I'll speak from an advocate position. As the co-facilitator of the Survivors of Medical Abuse, a non-funded self-help advocacy group born out of a great need to help survivors in the early 90s, and a member of the Voices on Healthcare Concerns and Accountability, and a counselor and lifestyle coach to victims of abuse, I appreciate the opportunity to make this important presentation. Well, it's been a decade, and it would appear, at least from our eyes, that nothing has changed. A lot of administration and bureaucracy have been implemented, but the real costs are still being incurred by the victims, and I speak of many real-life cases for which I am compelled to respect confidentiality. I am so very sorry to say that not only has nothing changed, but the offenders and the governing bodies who protect them have become even more sophisticated in finding and implementing new ways to protect them at further risk to patients, and it's supported by our government. It is important to restate this: thou shalt do no harm. It is very clear that this foundational pillar in the healthcare is conveniently forgotten in the medical and legal communities today. The legal system then supports the medical system by giving doctors every favor, and a victim can't even be a party to the proceedings while they are dishonored, humiliated, and tortured in public with no legal protection or recourse because they are only a complainant. I think it best to present the overview that my experience, those of my colleagues, and other victims are experiencing at present. It is very, very clear that the designer of, quote, protection of our own at all cost, end quote, is the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario, and some other of the 23 regulated professions have followed suit. It's important to ask these questions. How is it that a tribunal can use a criminal code style of legal conduct for the offender, but use the tribunal code when it comes to the victim? We still aren't clear on this. Why are the offenders given every favor while the complainants have no legal protection and are considered only a party to the proceedings? How is it that an offending doctor can use the Ontario Court of Appeals from a tribunal of a self-regulating body? We don't get that either. How is it that a complainant's medical and sexual history are still used to character slander them? And little, if any, investigation is made into the offender's history. How is it that every legal and financial advantage is given to the offender if they do get to discipline, while the victim is openly punished and re-victimized in the process for having complained? How is it that a disbarred lawyer was employed at the CPSO without their knowledge of his status, and then the government allows this man to presently serve on the Ontario Ombudsman's office? Why aren't the public protected by letting them know who is up for discipline or in the Court of Appeals? After all, so few offenders ever even make it to the discipline anyway. So what's the harm in protecting the public just a little bit? How is it that survivors hold no positions with salary or influence in any of the colleges on any boards, the Ministry of Health, etc., etc.? Yet offenders are conveniently relocated with handsome incomes and positions of influence and power within the system. These practices continue to discourage victims from coming forward, so some try the more traditional courts. But the courts are way beyond those victims' means. There is one person, when I spoke with them last, that had spent almost $200,000 to that date in legal fees in the pursuit of an offending doctor. The professionals are financially protected through the Ontario Medical Association, and the government subsidizes them and gave the doctors a raise. The victims had no protections, and the government has done nothing for them. What's sad is no one is doing anything to rectify this inequity. We all know that money buys justice. As long as victims are kept in this inequitable position, there will never be justice, and the offenders will continue to be supportive of their unconscionable acts of abuse. Further, college investigators and prosecutors who are supposed to work on behalf of victims are paid by their relevant college hiring their services. This is another loud and clear conflict of interest, and further, who pays the officers in the tribunal who make the decisions of guilt or innocence? We then look to the government. But I'm sorry to say that there is nobody here. It would appear that they do everything they can to allow the colleges to protect themselves at all costs, including that of the victims. A letter was sent to the Minister of Health in 1997 by our group asking some 13 questions about process, including inordinate protection of offending doctors, the rehiring of some offenders into choice positions within the healthcare system, the subsidizing of the Ontario Medical Association, the refusal of the association to disclose information to the public about collecting back legal fees incurred by doctors found guilty, and any fines imposed on offending doctors as per the RHPA. Over a year and a half later, we received a trite one-page insulting letter answering nothing. When we diligently pursued some answers, we were met with, well, your questions are very complex and our legal team is working on them. The legal indiscrepancies have to be interpreted. To this day, we still haven't heard a thing. And in fact, most of the key personnel have changed. If we, a group of advocates and survivors, can understand enough to ask simple questions without legal or financial help, how is it the ministry requires a team of lawyers to answer simple, direct questions? We see this as an act to protect the offenders and by ignoring victims' rights to get answers from their government. Maybe we will just finally get tired and go away. We pursued the minister responsible for women's issues once again. After an industrious chase, we were given the response from her office, quote, because sexual abuse is also experienced by men and children, it is not considered a woman's issue, end quote. I could not tell you the depths of despair this statement recreated with so many of us. We have pursued the Professional Relations Board for answers. Conveniently, the board doesn't keep copies of decisions they have made that have overturned the college. So why are they in place? Now, in all this, the Health Professions Regulatory Advisory Council was supposed to make a report to the Minister of Health in '95. Our inquiries on its status were met with a vague set of excuses disguised as reasons why the report had not been filed, and in fact we're told it was never to have been filed in '95. We felt an attempt was being made to make us feel that we were inept about how things work. Victims are penalized and punished to the point where many end up on welfare or disability. Then they are branded by this present government as welfare leeches and forced to live in substandard existence and then have their paltry sum cut by 26% because they had the incredible bravery to speak up. They were then set up to be further victimized in a myriad of ways in everyday life because we have no self-esteem left. In other words, they are perfect targets to be assaulted again, and when they are and they decide to speak up, they are tagged as the problem. Many can't get the kind of therapy they so desperately need because they have been sexually abused by their psychiatrists. Smart and courageous women, after being sexually abused by their healthcare provider, are so emotionally beaten down by the system who purport to act on their behalf, many never recover, and all victims are scared for life. Further, the family and friends of these victims are affected by these offenses as well. Aside from the emotional and spiritual cost, is anyone counting the dollar cost being incurred here, not only by the victims, but by the secondary ones, and the cost in extra health care, disability, welfare, family therapy, lost potential, lost contributions, lost taxes, and the list just keeps going on. Our hopes have failed us, and here we are today, no further ahead. In fact, more scared than ever before, as we believe in the systems that, like the healthcare, government, and the law that are supposed to protect us, just aren't. Victims pay taxes only to be abused, beaten up, and then called the problem. All have failed us in the most unconscionable ways that can be experienced by any human being. It's simply called soul murder. I have a little list of possible solutions. 1. Centralize the whole system of colleges under one court. Have one representative from each of the colleges coupled with survivors. Make it socially, economically, and career balanced. Hey, what a perfect place for work for survivors. 2. Substantially fund self-help groups. They are the experts about healing, not the psychiatrists, the lawyers, the politicians, or the academics. 3. Substantially increase and make the therapy monies payable directly to survivors. While we are at it, if the government can subsidize the OMA, they can subsidize survivors. 4. Each college who has an offender should be compelled to write a complete and sincere letter of apology to the victim on behalf of the offender, and of course, the offender should be encouraged in every way to write one as well. 5. Make patient respect and severe penalty for sexual abuse of patients mandatory training in medical schools. Survivors could present a 3-hour module from their perspective with appropriate remuneration, of course. 6. Make more use of the expertise of survivors and pay them as handsomely as offenders have been paid in their cushy jobs. 7. Make a firm commitment and take immediate action in an attempt to rebuild public trust by improving the legislation to be victim, not perpetrator friendly. Thank you.